are interrupting the show for a special report.
Because now it is time for Bag Lab.
Okay, tonight's Bag Lab is instructions on how to sort of piece fabric together. You can do this with really any sewing pattern. This particular example is the Goldenrod book cover. This one was sewn for me by Michelle Tripp, and as you can see, it's got a beautiful rainbow on the cover. These strips were all sewn as a quilt-as-you-go project. So if you're not familiar with quilt-as-you-go, actually I'm gonna have Danny switch the overhead camera right away so that I can show this again. Zoom out a little bit. There you go. Okay, so with quilt-as-you-go, you're attaching one strip or one piece of fabric at a time, and as you attach and flip the fabric so that it's right side facing, then you just quilt it. So by the time you've finished attaching all the strips, the whole piece is quilted, and I just thought, it's not quilted on the inside, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like on the inside. But this really adds a bit of wowza to a project, and it doesn't take too much time to assemble. You know, certainly the back could be plain, but just to have a nice cover with some piecing on it, or you could certainly piece the front and the back of a bag if you're working on a bag that you'd like to have featured as quilt-as-you-go. So I assembled a piece before the show, and I'm also going to partially demonstrate how to do this on camera as well. So I'm using my, where did I put my pattern piece? Here we go. So because I'm using the goldenrod pattern as an example, I'm going to piece some fabric for the front of the goldenrod. So I recommend you to rough cut the piece a little bit larger than the pattern piece, and then we'll cut that down to size afterwards. The reason we're rough cutting is because sometimes with quilting, the fabric and the interfacing tends to shrink down a little bit, and so with the rough cutting, you'll ensure that you have the correct size piece for your project. So I'm going to go ahead and just rough cut it a little bit larger than the piece. You don't even have to add the curved edges, and you can just go ahead and cut straight. And then let me get that started, and I'm going to flip my piece over and then cut the other half. You can also quilt to other materials like batting if the pattern that you're working on requests a different type of interfacing. But because this book cover uses the foam interfacing, that's what I'm going to use for the demonstration. And I went ahead and pre-cut my pieces. I decided that I wanted to have pieces sort of on the diagonal, just like this finished goldenrod book cover, but you could certainly have pieces going straight across or up and down, whatever you prefer. Okay, so what I did was I decided on using strips that were all 1 1/4 of an inch wide. Again, you can choose different widths for yours as well. And what I did was I approximately measured the biggest piece, which would be a piece that would go across the middle, and so I tried to cut most of my pieces this length. And again, that'll depend on the size of the piece and which orientation you're going to be placing the strips. Okay, so I'm going to start with my first piece. I'm just going to go ahead and lay it across the corner. You can put it fairly close to the corner if you'd like. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and sew the outer edges down to the foam, and that will prepare me to add my second piece. So I'm going to step over to the sewing machine, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew this about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of either the foam or the fabric over here. And I am going to use a slightly lengthened stitch length, so for this I'm going to use 3mm stitch length. Okay, so I've got that first piece sewn down, so now I'm going to add a second strip of fabric. So I'm going to place this second piece, mine are all solid, so there's not really a right or a wrong, but I'm going to be placing these pieces right sides together, making sure to align this edge over here with this first yellow strip. If you'd like to use traditional pins, you can, but I'm just going to go ahead and hold it in place with my fingers, and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from this edge of the fabric, and I'm going to keep using just that lengthened 3mm stitch length for sewing as well as for quilting. Okay, so I recommend instead of using a seam roller, and I don't have my iron on just because this cutting mat can't take an iron, but I recommend instead of using your iron in this type of motion, just to sort of finger press the strip away from the seam and just kind of set the iron on top. And the reason that you don't want to kind of glide it over the fabric in the interfacing is that you don't want to stretch out the fabric so kind of it warps as you're pressing. So you just want to kind of bring the iron down gently in an up and down motion. All right, so I'm going to, before I add my third strip, I'm going to do some machine quilting. So I'm going to sew, you can use whatever spacing that you'd like. I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from the seam on either side, and that'll sort of start my machine quilting off. And you can use a thread that stands out, or if you prefer, you can choose a thread that blends in, and I'm just going to go ahead and use white thread, which will really pop and make the quilting stand out. Okay, so now I'm going to add a third piece, and it's going to go, wash, rinse, and repeat, same process. So again, I'm going to align my third piece so that the raw edges are aligned, and I'm going to sew this edge again using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so just as before, I'm going to finger press this, and then you'll want to just bring your iron up and down on top of the fabric. And again, I'm going to stitch this 1/4 of an inch away from the edge on either side of the seam. Okay, so that's what it'll look like as you start to build. You'll be attaching the rest of your fabrics so that the whole piece is all covered. And this is what it will look like after you've got all of the pieces attached and quilted. And then after you've done that, you'll just want to take your pattern piece and you'll just want to cut this assembled strip piecing to size. So I'm just going to go ahead and lay this on top and actually use some of those Sew Tights magnets. And I'm just going to go ahead and use my friction pen for this one. You could certainly use your rotary cutter, but like I said, I'm generally just drawing out all my pattern pieces. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut out 1/2. And what I usually do here, you probably saw me making sort of a vertical marking. Anytime I have a pattern piece that I don't want to fold my piece in half. I just like to cut mirror images, and so I'll use that vertical line to align the pattern piece so that I can cut the other half. And I just think piecing and quilting fabric gives it just a really unique look. I've always enjoyed choosing fabrics that were special to me for my projects, but especially quilting something, I think has the potential to be sort of a showstopper when you're out and about. I think people will really notice a project that's been pieced and quilted. I think it just looks really unique and really different. So you would actually prepare this quilt-as-you-go panel while you're cutting out your fabric and attaching it to interfacing. And as you can see, I mean, it looks fine as my stripped piece, but after I cut it out, it just like really pops. And here's the finished example from the Goldenrod book cover. Just really special. These are all Tula Pink fabrics, and it just gives a really unique look to your project, and it really didn't take much time at all to assemble the strips for this. And you can use, like I mentioned before, you can use different size strips. You can do patchwork as well if you wanted something more intricate and involved, and you can also do different types of quilting, although the straight line quilting works really well with these particular strips and is just really easy to do. So I hope you enjoyed that demonstration. Let me know in the comments if you've ever made sort of a quilt-as-you-go project like this, and what kind of bag you made it for.